So Tame Impala have a new album out called The Slow Rush. It's been 5 years since their last album, 2015's Currents, and the wait has felt like a lifetime. Although I enjoyed Currents quite a bit upon release, my admiration for the album has only grown more and more in the last half a decade, and I now consider it to be one of my favourite albums of the 2010s, and maybe even just one of my favourite albums in general. Similar to Currents, The Slow Rush was written and recorded entirely by Kevin Parker, and it carries on the band's transition into psychedelic pop and disco sounds. While The Slow Rush doesn't have the catchy and pop-heavy appeal that Currents has, this is still a very fun, bouncy and well-produced album. The opening track, One More Year, is a great example of Parker's heavier adoption of electronic music on this album, with an almost Aphex Twin sounding rhythm section over this really groovy spliced vocal line. Parker sings about feeling like he's living the dream but worrying that it won't last forever and that aging will catch up with him. It's a really great track that is ambient while having the bounce that much of the album has. There are clear house influences throughout the album through its piano lines and pounding lively bass lines. The second to last song, Glimmer, definitely shows a French house mixed with ambient sound, almost sounding like a hybrid of Aphex Twin and Daft Punk. The album is centered around the theme of time and how it can give you great things as well as take things away from you throughout your life. It's definitely clear that Parker's recent marriage has had an impact over some of the lyrics, especially on the song Instant Destiny, which shows Parker singing about what seems like him convincing himself to propose to her. He sings about the finality of marriage and about focusing on the future rather than the past. It's a song that reminds me a little bit of some of the more synth-heavy tracks from Lonerism with the horns and falsetto-heavy chorus. The track Borderline is this great mixture of disco and soft rock with the hard-hitting drum lines, clav keyboards and Eastern European flute sounds. It's one of the catchiest songs on the album, reminding me definitely of the previous record. The track seems to be about embracing new experiences and letting them take you over. It's an incredibly bouncy and fun track and easily one of, if not my favourite on the record. I especially love the progression in the bridge. It's all around one of the best produced and performed tracks on the album. It's followed by Posthumous Forgiveness, which is this really great two-part track about Parker coming to terms with his relationship with his father following his death. The first part has this really great guitar line which reminds me of something that could have been on the first MGMT album. Parker's vocals have this really great usage of auto-tune on them which give the track this very otherworldly or robotic feel. This is only accentuated with the expansive synthesizers and almost psychedelic organ sections. The second part of the track is definitely much more of the psychedelic R&B sound of Currents with its huge wall of synthesizers and hip-hop inspired drum lines. Breathe Deeper also shows heavy influence from soft rock and blends it in with R&B and soul sounds. Parker cited Mariah Carey as an influence and that sound is definitely noticeable. Musically is one of the strongest on the album with very atmospheric and psychedelic synthesizers which blend perfectly with this kind of lo-fi out of tune pianos. This track has one of the best bass lines on the album as well, reminding me a lot of some of the best French house tracks. This sound is also heavily heard on Lost in Yesterday, which is a very bouncy funk track about nostalgia and letting go of bad memories. This song is probably the closest we get on the album to a catchy pop song like The Less I Know The Better. Its hook is incredibly memorable and catchy and I love the references to Groundhog Day. Is It True has this almost Talking Heads world beat sound in its rhythm section which blends really well with the psychedelic production and instrumentation. It Might Be Time is one of the heavier moments on the album with its very propulsive drum beat and siren-like guitars. It's incredibly dreamy, but as it progresses it ramps up and becomes one of the most aggressive and explosive tracks on the album. On this album, Parker definitely takes a wider influence from different sounds and styles rather than the R&B and pop sound that Currents focused on. Because of that, this album definitely has a lot more in common with their first two albums, and I don't think it would have been too surprising had this album come out straight after Lonerism. Parker's songwriting is really great, and lyrically the album features some of his strongest songs. The influence of soft rock and progressive rock blends perfectly with the electronic synth-heavy sound, and it leads to an album that feels experimental, expansive, and incredibly bouncy and dreamy. The album is definitely more artistically exciting than Currents, stepping away from the more mainstream appeal that album featured, but I definitely consider Currents to be a better written record. I connect to those songs more, and I find myself returning to that album constantly, whereas I can see myself kind of losing interest in this album by the end of the year. But as it stands, The Slow Rush is currently the best album of 20 2020, and it's just as great as anything else the band have released to date. If you weren't a fan of the more pop-based sound of Currents, then I definitely recommend this album because it does return to a lot of the sounds of the first two records, but at the same time it does share a lot of similarities to that previous record. So just try and go in a little bit open-minded if you weren't a fan of that album but liked their first two records. I'm really loving this album at the moment, and I'm interested to see if my opinion grows or lowers in the subsequent months and years, but for now I'm going to give The Slow Rush by Tame Impala 4.5 out of 5.